Welcome to this episode of The Build Up, presented by the Florida Home Builders Association, serving up fresh perspectives on politics, building, and beyond.
I want to welcome everyone to The Build Up. I'm your host, Ryan Benson, president of the Florida Home Builders Association and co-owner of A. Vernon Allen Builder, a premier custom home builder based in Naples and Sanibel.
And I'm John Riddle. I'm vice president of Turning Leaf Custom Homes. We're a custom builder based in Sanford, and we build throughout Central Florida. Ryan, I've got to tell you, I'm thrilled to be co-hosting. It's kind of like HGTV meets C-SPAN, but with much better punchlines and a lot less debris. If anything goes off the rails, just keep in mind, we're builders. We will definitely fix it.
Speaking of things that need no fixing, our guest today is always the highlight at the International Builders Show.
You know what, Ryan? You're right. If you've been to IBS, you know that his sessions are standing room only. He's sort of like the Beyonce of housing economics, except with more graphs and, thankfully, much fewer dance moves.
So Dr. Robert Dietz is the chief economist for the National Association of Home Builders. He's been with the NAHB for 20 years. He's obviously seen a lot of economic cycles. And before that, he was an economist for the Congressional Joint Committee on Taxation, graduating from The Ohio State University. And I want to jump right in. How did you go right out of college and into working with Congress?
Yeah, I spent a lot of time learning about housing and tax economics as an undergrad and graduate student. I got lucky. I was recruited as an economics major at George Washington University as an undergrad by their housing economist. He was friends with my eventual PhD advisor, who was a housing economist at The Ohio State University. And then when I went looking for a job, I could either go the professor route, and I didn't really want to do academia. And Congress and the Treasury Department and the Fed were looking for tax and real estate economists. So I ended up at Congress doing federal budgeting analysis, which is probably the last place you want to learn how to do a budget is Congress. But it was a good experience. I learned tax law and then joined NAHB about 3 years later.
Nice. And going to NAHB and your world here now, and this is going to be, I'd say, current topical, but referencing back to your experience through economic cycles. My first question is, what are we seeing today versus what we all experienced in 2007?
Yeah, I mean, we've got a policy in certain environments, so there's a little bit of a slowdown going on, but the structural housing market conditions are totally different than back in the Great Recession. I joined in late 2005, which I think was the peak of the housing market and the home building cycle, right before demand kind of went out, and we saw big declines in home prices and a rise in inventory. We're not going to experience anything like that. And the reason why was that back in that time period, the industry was building to demand that didn't exist. There was bad mortgage underwriting. There was a lot of speculative buying. And when the waters went out, in other words, when that demand kind of retreated, there was a lot of inventory looking for buyers. The reason that we have seen a run-up in prices over the last decade or so is due to supply side issues, not demand side. It's been a run-up in construction costs. We have a structural housing deficit of about 1 million homes. So during the cycle, you're going to have periods of time where higher costs, declines in affordability, elevated interest rates, and then some of the concerns about tariffs and some of these other factors are going to slow demand. But we still have those structural supply side issues. And so while we look for a slowdown, a little bit of price adjustment, we're not going to have a big retreat like we did in 2008.
Well, you mentioned tariffs, Dr. Dietz, and of course we've been seeing a lot of headlines lately about rising tariffs, and particularly on materials like steel and aluminum. And my builders in Florida, we're hearing murmurs about how this could hit the lumber market again. From your perspective, how might these latest trade policy changes impact material pricing and supply chain for our builders across the country?
Yeah, I'm a free trade, low tax economist, so I'm not a big fan of tariffs. And so when we look at the building material supply chain, there's a large number of building materials that are imported. It's a little less than 10% of our overall building material use, and it includes important items like the aluminum that goes into window and door frames, the softwood lumber, gypsum products from Mexico, refrigerators from Mexico. And then you've got a lot of Pacific trade that includes things like metal fasteners and literally the nuts and bolts that go into building homes. So we've tried to estimate the impact that builders have seen thus far from their suppliers for either tariffs that are in place, tariffs that are on pause, or tariffs that are anticipated in the future. And right now, the best guess is that for those seeing an increase in price, the average cost increase is around $10,000 to $11,000. Now that's kind of a guess. It's based on price notifications that have been received by builders, but they could go up. And let me use lumber as a good example.
Yeah, please do.
Lumber is subject to a lot of different tariffs and duties. So we already have on the Canadian lumber, which is about a quarter of the lumber that we consume, that Canadian lumber is subject to a 14.5% anti-dumping duty rate. It's something that's the president doesn't assign that, the Congress doesn't assign that. It's assigned by bureaucrats as part of a kind of a quasi-judicial action. Well, that 14.5% duty rate is likely to go up above 34% later this year. Now, that's just the duty alone. We also have under discussion a 25% tariff on Canadian and Mexican goods. Right now, that's kind of on pause for items like lumber, which is considered USMCA compliant. That was a win for the industry, that pause. But let's say that pause goes away. Then you're talking about stacking on top of the 34% duty rate, another 25%. And then we've got an additional national security tariff that could go on things like you mentioned, steel, pharmaceuticals, certain kinds of metals, and lumber as a national security arrangement. So if you stack these things together, you could quickly get to an 80% combined duty and tariff rate on Canadian lumber. So lumber prices right now are a little bit below $500 per thousand board feet. They're up more than 20% from a year ago. And unfortunately for builders and their customers, that price of lumber is likely to go up this year, but everything is just sort of uncertain right now. You have to see how the negotiations will play out.
Yeah, I've been reading our Concrete Builders Council has been busy in the social media world and those ancillary groups that are all surrounding that, and those ancillary groups are all saying now's the time we need to capture more market as a concrete builder.
Yeah, and concrete framed homes, which concentrate in the Southeast, they do represent about 10% of the market. That market share is likely to go up this year.
And going a little Florida specific, because we've got some other dynamics here that are playing into the I say some price settlement, demand settlement that we're seeing, like insurance. That's outside of a lot of the constraints from a national construction standpoint, but it's impacting the resale market, and it is having an impact. What do you see for Florida more specifically from demand and price settlement versus the rest of the nation?
I think it's really important when you look at the population data. Florida is still really solid from a kind of a long-term perspective. I mean, people are still going to move to Florida. They're still going to be moving to Texas, but there are unique concerns right now. I think insurance is one of them. We have seen a rise in inventory in some localized markets in terms of existing home sales. A lot of it is concentrated in the existing for sale condo market that has to do with the reinvestment in older buildings and potential increases in HOA fees. But the insurance issue is one that we're taking really seriously, because I think Florida is kind of ahead of the curve that's going to affect the rest of the country moving forward. The insurance pricing in some markets, you include Louisiana in this mix, up for some homeowners 200, 300%. I mean, really significant increases. And what's driving that? Well, some of it is frictions in the insurance market. There are some issues in terms of reinsurance rates going up for those insurance companies. But a lot of it is connected to issues that we as a building industry have been advocating for, which is the cost to build has been going up, either due to labor shortages, material issues, tariff issues. So it's always kind of interesting whenever we get something that would increase the cost of building a home. One of the very first calls I get is not from builders, it's from my peers in the insurance industry. They want to know, how much is it going to cost to build? I think insurance issues is one of those factors that policymakers are going to have to kind of wrap their arms around, because it's not just going to be localized effects. If it actually increases the cost to rebuild and remodel, that means everyone's insurance costs across the entire country are going to go up. And so I think this is an issue that once we get through some of the tariff issues and the tax issues, is really going to have to be addressed at the state and the national level.
Yeah, I think Florida felt like post-COVID that we had 10 years worth of growth in 3 years. And from an infrastructure standpoint, from everything, and the prices, because there was a supply side problem, went through the roof. And compounding that, I'd say our construction is the most resilient in the nation from a storm standpoint. So I am looking at this as Florida is on the forefront of each of these, which means we also might see the light coming out of it faster than everyone else if we turn into a recession scenario that it would be short, fast coming out. And I'm wondering if you see the same or think the same.
I agree with that. The general fundamentals for the overall Southeast are really positive. Florida has been leading that way. I mean, you talked about 10 years of growth in a 3-year period. Florida's population has been growing triple the rate of the country as a whole. So there's some sort of indigestion effects as you kind of try to move that kind of growth quickly. Where you do see a kind of a staggering of growth is a market like Louisiana. Louisiana has flat population growth. They are not able to kind of keep up with that pace because of these higher construction costs. So Florida and Texas are kind of the positive outcomes. And that's not to say that there won't be some readjustment of pricing. Housing affordability conditions are at multi-decade lows. If we go use Texas as an example, Austin, Texas, for example, right now prices are down 15% from peak. So it is possible to see 10% price declines. We're not going to see anything like what we saw back in 2008, but some localized price adjustments in the resale market is likely to take place as inventory levels increase.
Yeah, there's I know you say Florida's leading the way, Texas also, but there's this odd disconnect right now that we're seeing. And we, as a matter of fact, experienced it today. But right now, consumer confidence is relatively high, and interest rates are easing slightly. But a lot of homeowners or future buyers still feel like we're in a shaky economy. How would you make sense of that gap between perception and reality? And then as a follow-up, what should builders, our industry, be watching most closely as we move through the rest of the year?
It's incredible how politicized the data is right now. I mean, this is one of the things that the soft data, the confidence data is fairly weak. And when you look at the internals, I mean, we usually didn't have to do this, but when you look at the internals, Democrats in particular rate current economic conditions as very weak. Republicans are a little bit more positive, but it was the flip 6 to 9 months ago. So, the soft data is likely a warning that we will see some pullback in consumer spending. We are seeing it with businesses. There's a kind of a lot of wait and see approach to making that next investment. And that would include a home buyer who is potentially looking at, a rising inventory level or an opportunity to buy. And they're feeling a little more hesitant because they see stories about a rising unemployment rate. I think for builders communicating to buyers, remodelers, communicating with future clients, I think the argument is if you found the right home at the right price, 6 to 7% is the new normal mortgage interest rate. If you're a buyer and you've got parents that have a mortgage interest rate over 2 or 3%, that's just not coming back. And if it does, something terrible has happened for the economy. So communicating that most forecasters are saying 6 to 7% is the new normal. You're not going to benefit a lot from waiting. And if your current family conditions are such that you need to upgrade your home, go ahead and do it. And you can shop around, and there's a lot of opportunities to take advantage of incentives that builders are offering, including mortgage rate buydowns.
Yeah. Back in the mid to late 80s, my first home, embarrassingly so, my mortgage rate was 13%. And I thought I was getting a deal. I think I had a first-time home buyer's deal too at that point.
My dad's first home, he bought it at 18%. Yeah.
And I mean that was back then. Yeah, I agree. We're not going to see what we saw the days of even 4% mortgage rates. Don't sit and wait for that. You'd be waiting a long time, and it would be a catastrophic scenario that something like that comes up again. Then with this, you mentioned the buyer hesitancy. There's not much of a sense of urgency to get something. What do you think changes that? Is it the Fed resuming those rate drops? Is it settlement on the policy of these tariffs? Like what is that next step?
Those are the two that I'm looking at. I think the Fed is sort of talking a tough line right now. We know the president is unhappy with Chairman Powell, but the bond market, our own forecast says, look, we have made progress on inflation. The regulatory improvements, some of the governance changes are going to affect the supply side of the market. That's good for inflation. So my bet would be in the third and the fourth quarter, we're likely to get some additional Fed rate cuts. That helps on the short end of the yield curve. If we could just get some certainty on the tariff side, this is an economy that has pretty solid foundations. It's in, the Treasury Secretary talked about the detox period. It's a transition period. I think what we really need to know is what is the goal with the tariffs? Is it meant to be a replacement tax system that raises revenue? Or is it meant to be an incentive to encourage negotiations? And quite frankly, I think the Trump administration is trying to fight that out internally. There's an advisor, Peter Navarro, who's very kind of pro-tariff. He thinks that's where we need to raise revenue. There are other advisors, including the Treasury Secretary and the economist that runs the National Economic Council, Kevin Hassett, who see these as letting Trump be Trump and negotiate new deals. So I think we will get a little bit of positive momentum when we see the first new deals issued. A country like Japan or India, there'll be some momentum, a real incentive for other countries to kind of follow suit. And then we can get on to what we typically think as the pro-growth elements that would come out of the 2024 election, and that's extension of the 2017 tax cuts, and I think particularly for the building industry, a really pro-growth deregulatory agenda. And once we get to that, I think we're going to see buyers and businesses really kind of return to the market and invest and purchase new homes.
So if Jay Powell was not in office and all of a sudden the one and only Dr. Robert Dietz was named as Fed chair, would you cut rates?
Do we have breaking news
meeting?
here?
So if you were in Jay Powell's seat, would you cut rates at the next meeting, and by how much?
Yeah, I would be cutting 25 basis points a quarter right now. And that's not as fast as I think the president wants. But our argument has been, when you look at the overall inflation data, we've come below the 3% range. Yes, we're not down at 2%, but the leading contributor to inflation has been shelter inflation. It's the growth in rent, it's the growth in homeownership costs. And the reason shelter inflation has moved higher, this kind of parallels what we were talking about with building materials and insurance costs. Shelter inflation is higher because the cost of building is higher. And one of the factors that has contributed to the higher cost of building is the fact that the prime rate, which is set off the rate that the Federal Reserve sets, that prime rate has lifted the interest rate that builders pay for development and construction loans. So if you get some easing on the short end of the curve, that'll produce a nice supply response, particularly for single-family construction, bring the shelter inflation component down, and land the plane on inflation. Now, I was laughing, it's sort of the big debate over whether the president will fire Chairman Powell. Look, let's be honest here. One, I don't even know if he's got the legal authority to do that. But two, he would have to fire the entire board of governors to accomplish a change, because Fed policy is not set by one person. It's like the Supreme Court. There are, a variety of different votes, and I don't think it's worth the transition effects to go through firing a huge group of people and change policy. Because one of the issues we are facing right now, it's a real one, is a concern about U.S. stability. And when the stock market's going down, the bond market's going down, and the dollar is going down all at the same time, that can only happen when you have international investors saying, you know what, I'm going to invest in Europe right now, not the U.S., which is why it gets back to what you were mentioning earlier. Some wins, right? Some positive momentum will get a return in that international investment, because I watch the 10-year Treasury rate every single day, and we need people buying bonds in order to keep those rates low, which will help mortgage interest rates.
Yeah, even if he invokes the major loser clause
Right.
for it, there's not a mechanism that maintains stability with that. So.
No, and look, Trump is Trump, right? He's going to put that pressure on. He's not going to go quietly on those things. But to really enact a significant change in monetary policy, I think is something beyond a 2 to 3 year effort, and it's probably really not worth the cost at this point.
You mentioned some wins, and I'd like to kind of go back to that if I can. And here in the Florida market, so many people are moving down here. Affordability continues to be a front page issue. It's a constant topic for us to discuss locally, and I know statewide is the same thing. We've already addressed material costs. They're going up. Regulatory burdens are heaped upon us, and interest rate fluctuations. Yeah. And so therefore, we're squeezed from all sides. So knowing that and building on some of the comments you made earlier, can you repeat or maybe talk about a few more indicators, whether it's policy shifts or market signals that give you optimism that we'll get some relief in the near future?
Yeah, I'm a tax guy. You guys read my bio. I got started working in tax policy, but I think extension of the 2017 tax cuts is going to provide some momentum. It should help cause the stock market to readjust and get thinking about the long run rather than the day-to-day kind of social media environment. So I view that as an unambiguous positive. It takes time, right? Congress is working at the speed of Congress, and was the opposite of progress. It's Congress, so it takes a little bit of time as we move forward. But the regulatory agenda, I mean, we have already racked up some wins from the Trump administration via executive orders. The day one executive orders, one of them included a cost of living item that basically said, in addition to egg prices and gas prices, that housing prices and housing costs were too high. And I'm really proud of NAHB's research in this case, because in that executive order, he cited that analysis that we do every 5 years, where we try to add up the regulatory burden on the typical newly built single-family home. And it's about a quarter in a typical market of a newly built single-family home. Well, the president cited that in that executive order. In terms of actual policy wins, we've seen a pause on the FHA rule that would require builders to build to the 2021 IECC code. That was a rule that was put into place at the end of the Biden administration and would have increased construction costs, particularly for first-time buyers looking in the new construction space. And we're going to get a reproposal of the waters of the U.S. rule, which defines what kind of land has to be subject to a clean water permit, and really, in recent years, abused the definition of what is a navigable waterway to include things like irrigation, ditches, and low-lying areas that, when it rained, filled up with water. So we're going to get some rationality. We're going to declutter some of the red tape. Those things take longer because there's the Procedures Act in terms of how they're implemented. But I think there's some real opportunities there, and that's absolutely a source of optimism for the supply side of the economy. And it's ultimately the supply side of the economy that's going to help on things like housing affordability and inflation.
You talk about wins and the efforts of our team at NAHB with the legislators in D.C. Going a little bit further into that, how do we play, meaning we, the local builders, and when we come to D.C. for a legislative conference, how do we play a role with that, with your team?
Yeah, so we've got the June leadership meeting. We're going to have builders fill the halls of Congress, but I think builders really need to be contacting their local legislators and talking about the importance of housing supply. Housing supply to address housing affordability, housing supply as a job creator, and housing supply as an inflation fighter. Those are all going to be things that policymakers are really focused on right now. We just exited a presidential election that had the largest discussion of housing policy in about 50 years. So housing really is a topic that's being discussed in Washington. But we also have to keep in mind the really big fights, the places where we can see the biggest benefits for builders and remodelers and land developers is state and local policy. So, not only talking about the issues you talk about on cable news every night, but talking to the local policymakers about impact fees and speeding up permit costs and the importance of building that workforce housing that will attract business investment moving forward, because it's a race among various states. And if you get left behind, businesses are not going to locate in those markets.
Yeah.
And I agree on the local policy, and we're trying to get a lot of initiatives through in Florida that streamline that process and build more affordable housing. My other role is I serve on the board for the Florida Housing Finance Corporation, and there's a lot of initiatives right now that I think are putting Florida on the forefront of that because we have a lot of catch up to play from such an increase. Back to the DC part of it, what's the feeling inside the Beltway right now? Like, how is that? I mean, and you've been around through all sorts of cycles and presidents, administrations, and whatnot. Is it typical for this time with a new administration? Like, give us a sense of what that is.
This administration has more momentum behind what they want to do than any administration during my career. I mean, you compare Trump 2.0 to Trump 1.0, and it's just amazing. I mean, they really knew what they wanted to do. So, yes, you can, depending on your politics, you can maybe view it as chaotic, but the DOGE effort really hasn't had an impact on the structural of the federal government, and that will in turn then have an impact on maybe getting rid of some of these grant programs that reflected a bloated level of government spending. The Congress is 50-50, right? So Congress has had a tough time doing anything. Speaker Johnson has got a tough job in terms of getting those votes. But we do think the one policy item that they're going to be able to move through this Congress is extension of the 2017 tax cuts. They'll use budget reconciliation and achieve some other wins within that environment. And let's be clear, when we talked about interest rates, particularly mortgage interest rates, for the last 6 years, we really focused on the Fed. But going forward, the future of mortgage interest rates is going to be less dependent on the Fed and much more focused on the size of the government's debt and deficit. So if we can exercise some discipline within the legislature in terms of making sure that the debt and the deficit aren't growing as quickly as economic growth, that is going to help long-term interest rates by shrinking the size of the number of bonds that are being sold. And what we want investors to do is buy Fannie and Freddie bonds, which pushes mortgage rates down, rather than have to buy Treasury bonds to support a government debt and deficit.
And my last question is it's a lot lighter than the previous ones. What is the best interview you've ever got to do? Like, I knew you get to be on CNBC and CNN and MSNBC, like every network there is. What is that one interview that just stands out?
I'll give you two, right? An economist, I got to give you two answers. I did CBS Sunday Morning. That was really interesting because it's a little bit more, kind of soft soap approach, but it was great. They gave me enough time to really kind of explain things. That was a few years ago, and we really focused on the labor shortage and skilled labor development. So it was a great opportunity. The other fun one was back when I was basically a rookie on NHB. It was one of my first ones, and I worked with Fox Business News to explain how the homebuyer tax credit would work back in 2007 and 2008. And that was just a fun one. It stood out because it was a recognition that NHB just has a huge voice on policymaking, and just that opportunity to be able to explain a policy mechanism that was being done to help save the economy, still at that time really kind of struck me as important.
You see, John, we missed. The answer was supposed to be the build up for this was supposed to be the best interview he's ever done, and we missed it.
We're not finished yet. We're not finished yet. So
it was. I get it. That era Sunday Morning was just great. Like Charles was awesome. Yeah, I understand.
Well, we'll work our way up to being like one of his best hits. He'll talk about us on the next podcast about his favorite one to be at. Well, hey, listen, Dr. Dietz, we really appreciate you joining us. I know it's a quick conversation, but really good information. And, the most important thing for us is to continue to get the message out to our builders and let them know what's going on and how they can affect change. And your comments about how we're affecting change in DC are well spoken and well taken. I know from the Florida perspective, we make a big effort on impacting legislation here in the state. We'll look forward to bringing it up to DC in June. And then I know Ryan and I will be seeing you then also. But as always, your comments are spot on. And it's been a wonderful way to kick off our series. And if I make a quick note here, Ryan, for our listeners, remind them to subscribe so they don't miss what's next. Especially, and Dr. Dietz, this will be fun for Ryan and I. We'll be podcasting live, so we'll have our people at the SEBC walking through and watching us, and that'll be July 24th through the 26th. We're lining up guests right now, and hopefully have some real good conversations that people want to stop and talk with us a little bit more.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you again, Dr. Dietz. We appreciate it. To our listeners coming up, we're excited to have State Senator John Martin. John's been a friend for decades, has a fascinating story. So be sure you subscribe to The Build Up so you can get our next episode as soon as it's released. Until next time, build well and vote smart.
And that's a wrap on this episode of The Build Up, brought to you by the Florida Home Builders Association.